The Ignorant Schoolmaster 5 Lessons in Intellectual Emancipation. Chapter 5. The Emancipator and His Monkey. Page 101. The duty of Joseph Jacques' disciples is thus simple. They must announce to everyone, in all places and all circumstances, the news, the practice, one can teach what one doesn't know. A poor and ignorant father can thus begin educating his children. Something must be learned and all the rest related to it. On this principle, everyone is of equal intelligence. They must announce this principle and devote themselves to its verification, speak to the destitute person, make him talk about what he is and what he knows, show him how to instruct his child, copy the prayer that the child knows by heart, give him the first volume of Telemachy and have him learn it by heart, respond to the demand of those who want to learn from the master of universal teaching what he doesn't know. Finally, use all possible means of convincing the ignorant one of his power. A disciple in Grenoble couldn't persuade a poor and elderly woman to learn to read and write. He paid her to get her consent. She learned in 5 months, and now she is emancipating her grandchildren. 1. This is what must be done, all the while aware that a knowledge of Telemachy or of any other thing is, in itself, irrelevant. The problem is not to create scholars. It is to raise up those who believe themselves inferior in intelligence, to make them leave the swamp where they are stagnating, not the swamp of ignorance, but the swamp of self-contempt, of contempt in and of itself for the reasonable creature. It is to make emancipated and emancipating men. Page 102. Emancipatory method and social method. Universal teaching shouldn't be placed on the program of reformist parties, nor should intellectual emancipation be inscribed on the banners of sedition. Only a man can emancipate a man. Only an individual can be reasonable, and only with his own reason. There are 100 ways to instruct, and learning also takes place at the stultifier's school. A professor is a thing, less easily handled than a book, undoubtedly, but he can be learned, he can be observed, imitated, dissected, put back together. His person, available for observation, can be tested. One always learns when listening to someone speaking. A professor is neither more nor less intelligent than another man, and he generally presents a great quantity of facts for the researcher's observation. But there is only one way to emancipate. And no party or government, no army, school, or institution, will ever emancipate a single person. This is not at all a metaphysical proposition. The experiment was performed in Louvain, under the patronage of His Majesty, the King of the Netherlands. We know that the king was enlightened. His son, Prince Frederick, was taken with philosophy. Responsible for the army, he wanted it modern and educated, like the Prussian army. He was interested in Jacques, suffered because of the disgrace the academic authorities of Louvain held him in, and wanted to do something for him, and for the Dutch army as well. At that time the army was a privileged terrain for trying out reformist ideas and new pedagogies. The prince so conceived it, and persuaded his father to create a military school in Louvain and to confide the pedagogical mission to Jacques. This was a good intention but a poisoned gift. Jacques was a master, not the head of an institution. His method was designed to form emancipated men, not military instructors, or indeed servants of any kind of social speciality. Page 103. Let's understand this well. An emancipated man can just as well be a military instructor as a locksmith or a lawyer. But universal teaching cannot, without being spoiled, specialize in the production of a set kind of social actor, especially if these social actors are instructors of a body of men, military or otherwise. Universal teaching belongs to families, and the best that an enlightened ruler can do for its propagation is to use his authority to protect the free circulation of the service. An enlightened king can certainly establish universal teaching when and where he pleases, but such an establishment would not endure, for the human animal belongs to the old method. The experiment could undoubtedly be attempted, for the glory of the ruler. It would obviously fail, but there are instructive failures. Only one guarantee was required, the absolute concentration of power, the social scene swept clean of all its intermediaries to give free rein to just one couple, the king and the philosopher. This, then, was necessary, first, to get rid of all the advisers of the old method in the conventional manner of civilized countries, that is to say, by giving them all a promotion; second, to suppress all intermediaries other than those chosen by the philosopher; and third, to give all power to the philosopher. They would do what I said, everything I said, nothing but what I said, and the responsibility would weigh entirely on me. I would ask for nothing; on the contrary, the intermediaries would ask me what was to be done, and how it was to be done, everything to be proposed to the king. I would be regarded not as an employed functionary, but as a philosopher whose consultations were needed. Finally, the establishment of universal teaching would be considered, for the time being, the first and foremost of all the affairs in the kingdom. Point 2. These are conditions that no civilized monarchy could accommodate, especially for a sure failure. Nevertheless, the king insisted on the experiment, and Jacques, as grateful guest, accepted the bastard trial of cohabitation with a commission of military instruction, under the authority of the commander in charge at Louvain. Page 104. The school was created on this basis in March 1827, and the students, at first bewildered to hear through an interpreter that their professor had nothing to teach them, must have found some benefit in it, since at the end of their regular term, they petitioned to have their stay at school prolonged so they might learn languages, history, geography, mathematics, physics, chemistry, topographical drawing, and fortification by the universal method. But the master wasn't satisfied with this spoiled universal teaching, or with the daily conflicts with the civilian academic authorities and the military hierarchy. Through his outbursts, he hastened the demise of the school. He had obeyed the king in forming military instructors by an accelerated method. But he had better things to do than to fabricate second lieutenants, a type that will never be lacking in any society. What is more, he solemnly warned his students that they should never try to militate for the establishment of universal teaching in the army. But neither should they forget that they had witnessed an adventure of the mind a little greater than the fabrication of subaltern officers. You formed subalterns in a few months, it's true. But to persist in obtaining results as paltry as those of the European schools, civil as much as military, is to spoil universal teaching. Let society profit from your experiences and be content with them, that will make me happy, you will be useful to the state. But never forget that you have seen results of a much superior order to those you have obtained and to which you will be reduced. Make use, then, of intellectual emancipation for the benefit of yourselves and your children. Help the poor. But for your country, confine yourselves to making subalterns and academic citizens. You no longer need me to move forward in that rut. Point 3. This speech by the founder to his military disciples, he had some faithful ones, appears on the frontispiece of the mathematics volume of Universal Teaching, a work in which, in keeping with the master's frustrating habit in every matter, there isn't a single word about mathematics. Page 105. No one is a disciple of universal teaching if he hasn't read that work as the history of the École Normale in Louvain. If he isn't convinced of this opinion, universal teaching isn't and cannot be a social method. It cannot be propagated in and by social institutions. The emancipated are undoubtedly respectful of the social order. They know that it is, in any case, less bad than disorder. But that's all that they granted, and no institution can be satisfied with this minimum. It's not enough for inequality to be respected, it wants to be believed and loved. It wants to be explicated. Every institution is an explication in social act, a dramatization of inequality. Its principle is and always will be antithetical to that of a method based on equality and the refusal of explications. Universal teaching can only be directed to individuals, never to societies. Human societies, united in nations, from the Laplanders to the Patagonians, need form for their stability, some kind of order. Those who are responsible for maintaining the necessary order must explain and have it explained that this order is the best of all orders, and they must prevent any contradictory explanation. This is the goal of constitutions and laws. Every social order, relying on an explication, thus excludes all other explications and especially rejects the method of intellectual emancipation, based as it is on the futility and even the danger of explication in teaching. The founder even went so far as to recognize that the citizen of a state must respect the social order he's a part of, as well as the explication of that order, but he also established that the law only asked of a citizen that he conform his actions and words to this order, and could not impose thoughts, opinions, or beliefs on him, that the inhabitant of a country, before being a citizen, was a man, that the family was a sanctuary where the father was the supreme arbiter, and that, consequently, it was there and there alone that intellectual emancipation could be fruitfully sown. Point 4. Let's affirm, then, that universal teaching will not take, it will not be established in society. But it will not perish, because it is the natural method of the human mind, that of all people who look for their path themselves. What the disciples can do is to announce to all individuals, to all mothers and fathers, the way to teach what one doesn't know on the principle of the equality of intelligence. Page 106. Emancipation of men and instruction of the people. It must be announced to everyone. First, undoubtedly, to the poor. They have no other way to educate themselves if they can't pay the salaried explicators or spend long years on school benches. And above all, it is on them that the prejudice of the inequality of intelligence weighs most heavily. It is they who must be raised up from their humiliated position. Universal teaching is the poor's method. But it isn't a method of the poor. It's a method of men, that is to say, of inventors. Whoever employs it, no matter what his science or his rank, will multiply his intellectual powers. It must therefore be announced to princes, ministers, and the powerful. They cannot institute universal teaching, but they can apply it to teach their children. And they can make use of their social prestige to announce the service far and wide. Thus the enlightened king of the Netherlands would have done better to teach his children what he didn't know, and to speak out for the diffusion of emancipatory ideas to families throughout the kingdom. Thus Joseph Jacques' former colleague, General Lafayette, could announce it to the President of the United States, a new country not weighed down by centuries of scholastic stultification. In the days following the July Revolution of 1830, the founder left Louvain for Paris to indicate to the victorious liberals and progressives the means of realizing their good thoughts regarding the people. General Lafayette had only to spread universal teaching throughout the National Guard. Casimir Perier, former enthusiast of the doctrine and future Prime Minister, was now in a position to spread the service far and wide. Barth, Laffitte's Minister of Public Instruction, came, himself to consult with Joseph Jacques. What must he do to organize the education that the government owes the people and that he intends to give them according to the best methods? Nothing, answered the founder. Government doesn't owe the people an education, for the simple reason that one doesn't owe people what they can take for themselves. Page 107. An education is like liberty, it isn't given, it's taken. So what must be done? Asked the minister. You need only announce, he replied, that I am in Paris at the Cornet Hotel, where every day I receive fathers of poor families to show them the means of emancipating their children. It must be told to all those who worry about science or the people, or both. The learned should also learn it. They have the means of increasing their intellectual power tenfold. They think they are only capable of teaching what they know. We are aware of that social logic of false modesty where what one renounces establishes the solidity of what one announces. But scholars, those who research, certainly, not those who explicate the knowledge of others, perhaps want something a little newer and a little less conventional. Let them begin teaching what they don't know, and maybe they will discover unsuspected intellectual powers that will put them on the road to new discoveries. It must be told to Republicans who want a free and equal people and who imagine that this is a matter of laws and constitutions. It must be told to all men of progress, who, with generous hearts and fiery brains, inventors, philanthropists, and lovers of mathematics, polytechnicians and philotechnicians, Fourierists, and Saint-Simonians scour the countries of Europe and the fields of knowledge in search of technical inventions, agronomical ameliorations, economic formulas, pedagogical methods, moral institutions, architectural revolutions, typographical procedures, encyclopedic publications, etc., for the physical, intellectual, and moral improvement of the poorest and most numerous class. They can do much more for the poor than they think, and at less expense. They spend time and money experimenting with and promoting grain lofts and middens, fertilizer and conservation methods, in an attempt to improve cultivation and enrich the peasants, to clean the rot out of farm streams and the prejudices out of rustic minds. Page 108. It is much simpler than that, with a used copy of Telemachy, or even a pen and some paper to write down a prayer, they can emancipate the inhabitants of the countryside, make them conscious of their intellectual power, and the peasants themselves will set about improving cultivation and grain conservation. Stultification is not an inveterate superstition, it is fear in the face of liberty. Routine is not ignorance, it is the cowardice and pride of people who renounce their own power for the unique pleasure of affirming their neighbor's incapacity. It is enough to emancipate. Don't ruin yourselves by inundating lawyers, notaries, and pharmacists of sub-prefectures with encyclopedic volumes intended to teach the inhabitants of the countryside the healthiest ways to preserve eggs, brand sheep, hasten melon ripening, salt butter, disinfect water, fabricate beet sugar, and make beer out of pea pods. Show them rather how to make their son repeat Calypso, Calypso could not, and you will see what they can do. Such is the unique chance of intellectual emancipation. Each citizen is also a man who makes a work, with the pen, with the drill, or with any other tool. Each superior inferior is also an equal who recounts and is in turn told by another, the story of what he has seen. It is always possible to play with this relation of self to self, to bring it back to its primary veracity and waken the reasonable man in social man. Whoever doesn't seek to introduce the method of universal teaching into the workings of the social machine may awaken that entirely new energy that fascinated lovers of liberty, that power without gravity or agglomeration that is propagated in a flash by the contact between two poles. Whoever forsakes the workings of the social machine has the opportunity to make the electrical energy of emancipation circulate. Only the stultified followers of the old master and those powerful in the old mode will be cast aside. They were already anxious about the evils of instruction for the sons of the people, imprudently cut off from their condition. What is speaking about emancipation and the equality of intelligence worth, if it is only to say that husband and wife have the same intelligence? Page 109. A visitor had already asked Jacques if women in these circumstances would still be pretty. Let's deprive the stultified of a response, then, and let them turn about within their academico-noble circle. We know that it is this that defines the stultifying vision of the world, to believe in the reality of inequality, to imagine that the superiors in society are truly superior, and that society would be in danger if the idea should spread, especially among the lower classes, that this superiority is only a conventional fiction. In fact, only an emancipated person is untroubled by the idea that the social order is entirely conventional, only he can scrupulously obey superiors that he knows are his equals. He knows what he can expect of the social order and will not make a big to-do about it. The stultified have nothing to fear, but they will never know it. Men of progress. Let's leave them, then, to the sweet and anxious consciousness of their genius. But standing right beside them is no lack of men of progress who shouldn't fear the overturning of the old intellectual hierarchies. We understand men of progress in the literal sense of the term, men who move forward, who are not concerned with the social rank of someone who has affirmed such and such a thing, but go see for themselves if the thing is true, voyagers who traverse Europe in search of all the procedures, methods, or institutions worthy of being imitated, who, when they have heard tell of some new experiment here or there, go to see the facts, try to reproduce the experiment, who don't see why 6 years should be spent learning something, if it's been proved that it can be done in 2, who think, above all, that knowledge is nothing in itself and that doing is everything, that the sciences are pursued not to be explicated but to produce new discoveries and useful inventions, who therefore, when they hear about profitable inventions, are not content to praise them or critique them, but instead offer, if possible, their factory or their land, their capital or their devotion, to give them a try. Page 110. There is no lack of voyagers and innovators of this kind who are interested in, even enthusiastic, about possible applications of the Jacques method. They might be teachers in conflict with the old master like Professor Durietz, nourished since his youth on Locke and Condillac, Helvetius and Condorcet, who had early on mounted an assault on the dusty edifice of our Gothic institutions. 5. A professor at the Central School in Lille, he had founded in that city an establishment inspired by the principles of his masters. A victim of the emperor's consuming hatred for the ideologues, for any institution that didn't go along with his goal of universal servitude, but still devoted to shaking off backward methods, he went to the Netherlands to undertake the education of the son of the Prussian ambassador, the Prince of Hatzfeld. It is there that he heard about the Jacques method, visited the establishment that a former polytechnician, Desprez, had founded on those principles, recognized their conformity with his own, and decided to propagate the method wherever he could. This is what he did for 5 years in St. Petersburg at Grand Marshal Paskov's, at Prince Sherbretov's, and at the homes of several other dignitaries who were friends of progress, before returning to France not without propagating emancipation en route at Riga and Odessa, in Germany and Italy. He now wanted to chop down the tree of abstractions and, if he could, pull it out by the fibers of its deepest roots. 6. He spoke about his projects to Ternauz, the famous textile manufacturer and a deputy of the extreme liberal left. No more enlightened industrialist could be found. Ferdinand Ternauz was not content to reorganize his father's tottering factory and make it prosper during the troubling times of the Revolution and the Empire. He wanted to be useful to the national industry in general, by favoring the production of cashmere. To this end, he recruited an Orientalist from the Bibliothèque Nationale and sent him to Tibet to find a herd of 1,500 goats to be acclimatized to the Pyrenees. Page 111. An ardent friend of liberty and the Enlightenment, he wanted to see for himself the results of the Jacques method. Convinced, he promised his support, and with his help, Durietz felt strengthened in his quest to annihilate the dealers in supines and gerunds and other satraps of the university monopoly. Ferdinand Ternauz was not the only industrialist to move ahead in this way. In Mulhouse, the Industrial Society, an institution pioneered by the philanthropical dynamism of the Dollfuss brothers, confided a course in universal teaching for workers to the care of its young animator, Dr. Pinot. In Paris, a more modest industrialist, the Dyer Beauvisage, heard tell of the method. A worker who had made it on his own, he wanted to extend his affairs by founding a new factory in the Somme. But in so doing, he didn't want to be separated from the workers, the brothers of his origins. A Republican and Freemason, he dreamed of making his workers his associates. Unfortunately, this dream ran up against an unpleasant reality. In his factory, as in all the others, the workers were envious of each other and only got along when in opposition to the master. He wanted to give them the education that would destroy the old man in them and would permit the realization of his ideal. For this, he addressed himself to the Rancière brothers, fervent disciples of the method, one of whom preached emancipation every Sunday in the Halle Auxiliary Draps. In addition to the industrialists, there were progressive military men, ingenious officers principally of the artillery, guardians of the revolutionary and polytechnic tradition. Thus Lieutenant Skalker, the son of a rich porcelain maker and an officer of genius at Valenciennes, went regularly to visit Joseph Jacotot, who had temporarily retired there. One day he brought with him his brother Victor, who wrote in various newspapers, who had visited the United States and returned indignant that there could still exist in the 19th century that denial of humanity called slavery. Page 112. But the archetype of all these progressives was surely the Count of Lastari, a septuagenarian, and president, founder, or mainspring of the Society for the Encouragement of National Industry, the Society for Elementary Education, the Society for Mutual Teaching, the Central Society for Agronomy, the Philanthropic Society, the Society of Teaching Methods, the Vaccina Society, the Asian Society, the Journal d'Education et d'Instruction, and the Journal de Connaissances Usuelles. Please don't snicker, imagining some pot-bellied academician, peacefully snoozing away in presidential armchairs. On the contrary, de Lastari was known for not staying in one place. In his youth, he had visited England, Italy, and Switzerland to perfect his knowledge of economics and improve the management of his domains. At first a partisan of the revolution like his brother-in-law, the Marquis de Lafayette, he nevertheless, toward year 3, was obliged to go hide his title in Spain. There he learned the language well enough to translate various anti-clerical works, studied merino sheep well enough to publish 2 books on the subject, and appreciated their merits well enough to bring a herd back to France. He traveled through Holland, Denmark, Sweden, whence he brought back rutabaga, Norway, and Germany. He looked into the fattening of livestock, into the appropriate kinds of pits for grain storage, into the cultivation of cotton, and of indigo plants and vegetables that produce the color blue. In 1812 he learned of Louis Sennefelder's invention of lithography. He immediately left for Munich, learned the process, and created the first lithographic press in France. The pedagogical power of this new industry oriented him toward questions of education. He was then militating for the introduction of mutual teaching using the Lancastrian method. But he wasn't at all exclusive. Among other societies, he founded the Society of Teaching Methods for the study of all pedagogical innovations. Alerted by public rumor of the miracles being produced in Belgium, he decided to go see them for himself. Page 113. Still alert at 70 years old, he would live 20 more, writing books and founding societies and journals to cleave obscurantism asunder and promote science and philosophy. He took the mail carriage, saw the founder, visited Miss Marcelise's institution, gave improvisations and compositions to the students to do, and verified that they wrote as well as he did. The opinion of the equality of intelligence didn't frighten him. He saw in it a great encouragement to the acquisition of science and virtue, a blow far more deadly than any material power to be struck against the intellectual aristocracy. He hoped that its exactitude could be shown. So, he thought, the pretensions of those proud geniuses would disappear, those who, believing themselves privileged by nature, believe themselves equally in the right to dominate their fellow men and to reduce them to the level of beasts, so as to enjoy exclusively the material gifts that blind fortune distributes and that are known to be acquired by profiting from human ignorance. 7. He came back to announce it to the Society of Teaching Methods. An immense step had just been taken for civilization and the happiness of the human species. It was a new method that the society must examine and recommend to the first rank of those best suited to hasten the progress of the people's education of sheep and men. Jacques appreciated the Count's zeal. But he was immediately obliged to denounce his distraction. It was strange, in fact, for someone who applauded the idea of intellectual emancipation to then submit it to the approbation of a society of methods. What exactly is a society of methods? An areopagus of superior minds who want mass education and try to select the best methods of arriving at it. This evidently supposes that poor families are incapable of selecting on their own. For that they would have to be already educated. In such a case, they wouldn't need instruction. In such a case, there would be no need for the society, which is contradictory with the hypothesis. Page 114. It's a very old ruse, the learned society one, by which the world has always been duped and probably always will be. The public is forestalled from taking the pains to examine things. The journal is in charge of seeing, the society takes care of judging, and to give themselves an air of importance that intimidates the lazy, they don't praise, never blame, neither too much nor too little. Only a small mind admires unreservedly, but by praising or blaming in a measured fashion, besides gaining a reputation for impartiality, one is thus placed above those one judges, one is worth more than they, one has wisely sorted out the good from the mediocre and the bad. The report is an excellent stultifying explication that cannot help being successful. Several little axioms are invoked in addition, and used to interlard one's speech. Nothing is perfect, one must mistrust exaggeration, time will tell. One of these characters takes the floor and says, "My dear friends, we agree among ourselves that all good methods will be put to our test, and that the French nation will have confidence in the results that derive from our analysis. The people out in the departments cannot have societies like ours to direct their judgments. Here and there, in some of the big towns, there are some little testing places, but the best test, the test par excellence, is only found in Paris. All the good methods compete for the honor of being refined, verified by our test. Only one purports to revolt, but, we insist, it will fade like the others. The member's intelligence is the vast laboratory wherein the legitimate analysis of all methods is performed. In vain does universal teaching argue against our rules, they give us the right to judge it, and we will judge it. Point 8. Yet don't think that the Society of Methods judged the Jacques method with ill will. It shared its president's progressive ideas and knew how to recognize all that was good in the method. Undoubtedly a few snickering voices were raised in the Areopagus of professors to denounce this marvelous simplification brought to the job of teaching. Undoubtedly some minds remained skeptical when confronted with the curious details that their indefatigable president brought back from his voyage. Other voices besides made themselves heard denouncing the charlatan's dramatization, the carefully prepared visits, the improvisations learned by heart, the original compositions copied from the master's books, books that opened all by themselves to the same spot. Page 115. They also laughed about the master who didn't know how to play guitar, whose student played a different melody from the one he had under his eyes. Point 9. But the members of the Society of Methods weren't meant to believe one report. Froussard, a skeptic, went to verify de Lastary's report and came back convinced. Boutmy verified Froussard's enthusiasm, then Baudouin Boutmy's. All returned convinced. But they all returned equally convinced precisely of the eminent progress that this new teaching method represented. They weren't at all concerned with announcing it to the poor, with using it to instruct their children, or with using it to teach what they didn't know. They asked that the society adopted for the orthomatic school it was organizing, something that would demonstrate the excellence of the new methods. The majority of the society and de Lastary himself opposed this. The society could not adopt one method to the exclusion of all those that present themselves or that will present themselves later on. That would prescribe limits to perfectibility and destroy the central tenet of the society's philosophical faith and its practical reason for being, the progressive perfecting of all good methods past, present, and future. Point 10. The society refused the exaggeration, but, imperturbably serene and objective in the face of the jeers about universal teaching, it allocated a room in the orthomatic school to the Jacques method of teaching. Such was de Lastary's inconsistency. In earlier days he hadn't thought to convoke a commission on the value of merino sheep or lithography, to make a report on the necessity of importing one or the other. He imported them himself so he could try them out on his own. But he judged differently when it came to importing Emancipation. This was for him a public affair that must be treated by society. This unfortunate difference was itself based on an unfortunate identification. He confused people to be educated with a flock of sheep. Flocks of sheep don't drive themselves, and he thought it was the same for men. Certainly they had to be emancipated, but it was up to enlightened minds to do it, and for that, all ideas should be put in common in order to find the best methods, the best instruments of emancipation. Page 116. Emancipation for him meant putting light in obscurity's place, and he thought that the Jacoto method was one method of instruction like the others, a system for enlightening minds comparable to the others, an invention that was certainly excellent but of the same nature as all those that proposed, week after week, a new perfecting of the people's education, Berkel's panlexicography, Dupont's citolechi, Montimont's techniques, Auden's stereometries, Painpier and Lupin's typography, Kaulanthvenot's tachygraphy, Fayette's stenography, Carstairs' calligraphy, Jaświnski's Polish method, the Gallic method, the Levi method, the methods of Sinoke, Coupe, Lacombe, Messner, Schlott, Alexis de Noailles, and 100 others whose books and memoirs piled up on the Society's desk. From then on, everything was set: society, commission, examination, report, journal, there's good and bad in it, time will tell, nec probatis nec improbatus, and so on until the end of time. When it was a question of agricultural and industrial improvements, de Lastari had acted in the manner of universal teaching. He had seen, compared, reflected, imitated, tried, corrected by himself. But when it was a matter of announcing intellectual emancipation to the fathers of poor and ignorant families, he was distracted, he forgot everything. He translated equality as progress and the emancipation of the fathers of poor families as education the people. And in order to be concerned with these abstractions, these ontologies, other abstractions, corporations were necessary. A man can drive a herd of sheep. But for the herd people, a herd called learned society, university, commission, review, etc., was necessary. In short, stultification, the old rule of the social fiction. Intellectual emancipation pretended to replace it. Yet it found stultification there on its own route, erected as a tribunal charged with trying out universal teachings, principles and exercises for their suitability or unsuitability to families, and with judging it in the name of progress, and indeed in the name of the emancipation of the people. Page 118. The Progressive Circle. The inconsistency did not owe simply to de Lastari's weary brain. It was the contradiction that intellectual emancipation meets head-on when it addresses itself to those the men of progress who want, just as it does, the happiness of the poor. The oracle of stultification had warned the founder well: today more than ever, you cannot hope for success. They believe themselves to be progressing, and their opinions are solidly hinged on this. I laugh at your efforts, they will not budge. The contradiction is easy to expose. We said, a man of progress is a man who moves forward, who goes to sea, experiments, changes his practice, verifies his knowledge, and so on without end. This is the literal definition of the word progress. But now a man of progress is something else as well, a man whose thinking takes the opinion of progress as its point of departure, who erects that opinion to the level of the dominant explication of the social order. We know, in fact, that explication is not only the stultifying weapon of pedagogues but the very bond of the social order. Whoever says order says distribution into ranks. Putting into ranks presupposes explication, the distributory, justificatory fiction of an inequality that has no other reason for being. The day-to-day work of explication is only the small change of the dominant explication that characterizes a society. Wars and revolutions change the nature of dominant explications by changing the form and limits of empires. But this change is narrowly circumscribed. We know, in fact, that explication is the work of laziness. It need only introduce inequality, and that is done at little expense. The most elementary hierarchy is that of good and evil. The simplest logical relationship that can serve to explain this hierarchy is that of before and after. With these four terms, good and evil, before and after, we have the matrix of all explications. Things were better before, say some, the legislator or the divinity arranged things, people were frugal and happy, leaders paternal and obeyed, the ancestors' faith respected, functions well distributed, and hearts united. Page 118. Now, words are corrupted, distinctions crumble, ranks are confused, and solicitude for the young has been lost, along with respect for the aged. Let's try then to preserve or revive that which, in our distinctions, still holds us to the principle of the good. Happiness will come tomorrow, respond the others. The human species was like a child left to the caprices and terrors of his imagination, rocked to sleep with ignorant nursemaids' fairy tales, subjected to the brutal force of despots and priestly superstition. Now, minds are enlightened, customs are civilized, and industry spreads its benefits, people know their rights, and education will reveal to them their duties with science. Capacity must from now on decide social ranks. And it is education that will reveal and develop it. We are at the moment when a dominant explication is in the process of succumbing to another's conquering force, an age of transition. And this is what explains the inconsistency of men of progress like the Count. Before, when the university blundered through Barbara, Celerant, and Barra-Lipton, there were, outside of it, gentlemen or doctors, bourgeois or church people, who allowed it to go on speaking and were busy doing something else. They had lenses cut and polished, or polished them themselves for optical experiments. They had their butchers save them animals' eyes so they could study anatomy. They informed each other of their discoveries and debated each other's hypotheses. Thus, in the pores of the old society, progress, that is, realizations of the human capacity to understand and to do, was accomplished. The Count still resembles these experimental gentlemen a little. But as time passed, he had been snatched up by the rising force of the new explication, the new inequality, progress. It is no longer the curious and the fault-finders who perfect one or another branch of the sciences, such and such a technical method. It's society that perfects itself, that takes perfectibility as the watchword of its order. It's society that progresses, and a society can only progress socially, that is to say, all together and in good order. Progress is the new way of saying inequality. Page 119. But that way of saying it has a much more formidable force than the old way. The latter was continually obliged to go against the grain of its principle. Things were better before, it said, the more we advance, the closer we get to decadence. But this dominant opinion had the shortcoming of not being applicable to the dominant explicatory practice, that of pedagogues. These people were certainly obliged to suppose that the child approached his perfection by being distanced from his origin, by growing up and progressing under their direction from his ignorance to their science. Every pedagogical practice explains the inequality of knowledge as an evil, and a reducible evil in an indefinite progression toward the good. All pedagogy is spontaneously progressive. Thus there was a discordance between the grand explication and the little explicators. Both were stultifying, but in a disorderly fashion. And this disorder within stultification left some space open for emancipation. Those times were ending. Thereafter, the dominant fiction and the daily stultification went in the same direction. There is a simple reason for this. Progress is the pedagogical fiction built into the fiction of the society as a whole. At the heart of the pedagogical fiction is the representation of inequality as a retard in one's development. Inferiority, in its innocence, lets itself be taken in, neither a lie nor violence. Inferiority is only a lateness, a delay, that is posited so one can put oneself in the position of curing it. Of course, this will never happen. Nature itself makes sure of it. There will always be delay, always inequality. But one can thus continually exercise the privilege of reducing it, and there are double benefits to be gained from this. The progressive's presuppositions are the social absolutizing of what is presupposed by pedagogy. Before, steps were taken gropingly, blindly, words were gathered more or less badly from the mouths of unenlightened mothers or nursemaids, things were guessed at, false ideas drawn from the first contact with the material universe. Now, a new age is beginning, the one where the man-child takes the right road to maturity. Page 120. The guide points to the veil covering all things and begins to raise it suitably, in order, step by step, progressively. A certain delay must be worked into the progress. 11 methods are necessary. Without a method, without a good method, the child man or the people child is prey to childish fictions, to routine and prejudices. With a method, he sets his feet in the footsteps of those who advance rationally, progressively. He grows up in their wake in an indefinite process of coming closer. Never will the student catch up with the master, nor the people with its enlightened elite, but the hope of getting there makes them advance along the good road, the one of perfected explications. The century of progress is that of the triumphant explicators, of humanity pedagogicized. The formidable force of this new stultification is that it still imitates the approach of the men of progress of a former day. It attacks the old stultification in terms that will put minds just alerted to emancipation on the wrong scent, will make them stumble at the slightest distraction. This is also to say that the ongoing victory of the progressives over the old master is just as much the old master's victory by virtue of their very opposition, the absolute triumph of institutionalized inequality, the exemplary rationalization of that institution. And this is the solid foundation on which the perennial power of the old master is based. The founder tried to show this to the progressives of good faith. The explicators of industry and everyone have already repeated, look at civilization's progress. The people need arts, and we sold them only Latin they can't use. They will draw, design machines, etc. Philosophers, you are right, and I admire your zeal under the reign of a great master who doesn't help you at all, lounging lazily on his throne of dead languages. I admire your devotion. Your philanthropical goal is undoubtedly more useful than that of the old master. But aren't your ways the same as his? Isn't your method the same? Aren't you afraid of being accused of sustaining, as he does, the supremacy of the master explicators? 12 page 121. Goodwill thus risks becoming an aggravating circumstance. The old master knows what he wants stultification and he works to that end. The progressives, on the other hand, want to liberate minds and promote the abilities of the masses. But what they propose is to perfect stultification by perfecting explications. This is the progressive circle. They want to tear minds away from the old routine, from the control of priests and obscurantists of any kind. And for that, more rational explications and methods are necessary. They must be tested and compared by way of commissions and reports. A qualified and licensed personnel, learned in the new methods and monitored on their execution of them, must be employed to educate the people. Above all, the improvisations of incompetence must be avoided. One must not permit minds formed by chance or routine, ignorant of the perfected explications and progressive methods, to have the possibility of opening a school and teaching anything in any which way. Families, those places of the routine reproducing of inveterate superstition, of empirical knowledge and obscure sentiment, must be prevented from taking on their children's instruction. For this, a well-ordered system of public instruction is necessary. A university and a great master are necessary. It will be pointed out in vain that the Greeks and Romans had neither a university nor a great master, and that things didn't go badly for them. In the era of progress, the most ignorant of backward peoples need no more than a brief stay in Paris to be convinced that Anytus and Meletus demonstrated from that point on the necessity of an organization that determines, 1. That one must explicate, 2. What one will explicate, 3. How one will explicate it. Without these precautions, they see clearly that, 1. Our shoemakers might put universal teaching around the boot on their signs, as was done in Rome or Athens, for want of a careful organization, and, 2. The tailor will want to explain developable surfaces, without any previous examination, as occurred in Rome, with the result that what must at all costs be avoided will come to pass. The old explications will be transmitted from age to the detriment of perfected explications. 13 page 122. The perfecting of instruction is thus first the perfecting of tethers, or rather the perfecting of the representation of the usefulness of tethers. The permanent pedagogical revolution becomes the normal regime under which the explicatory institution is rationalized and justified, assuring at the same time the perpetuity of the old methods, principles and institutions. By fighting for the new methods, for Lancaster's mutual teaching, the progressives fought first to show the necessity of having better tethers. You know that we don't want Lancaster at all, and you have figured out why. And yet we've ended up letting you do your Lancaster. Do you know why? It's that the tether is still there. It will be better held by different hands. But one need never despair wherever there is a tether. Your applied geometry doesn't appeal to us either, but it can nevertheless be formally applied. 14. They let the Lancastrian method get by. Soon, undoubtedly, they'll let industrial teaching get by. It was a tether, as good as any other tether, less for what it could furnish in the way of instruction than for what it could make people believe about the inegalitarian fiction. It was another writing school that would oppose the old one only to better affirm its principle, the principle of all writing schools. They were circling around in Latin, the writing master will make them circle around in machins. If we don't watch out, stultification is going to become greater because less noticeable and easier to justify. 15. On the heads of the people. Let's go farther. Universal teaching can also become a good method integrated into this renovation of stultification, a natural method that respects the intellectual development of the child all the while procuring for his mind the best of gymnastics, an active method that makes him habituated to reasoning for himself and confronting difficulties alone, that creates self-assurance in speech and a sense of responsibility, page 123. A good classical foundation, learning language at the school of the great writers, disdaining grammarians' jargon, a practical and expeditious method that does away with the costly and interminable stages of college to form enlightened and industrious young people, ready to launch themselves into careers useful for the perfecting of society. Whoever can do the most can do the least, and a method used to teach what one doesn't know permits teaching by playing with what one knows. Good masters are opening schools under its name, proven masters like Durietz, like the young Eugene Boutmy, like Desprez, the former Polytechnician, who moved his institution from Anvers to Paris, and a swarm of others, in Paris, Rouen, Metz, Clermont-Ferrand, Poitiers, Lyon, Grenoble, Nantes, Marseille. Not to mention religious and more or less enlightened institutions, like the Institute of the Word Incarnate, where Guillard, who had made the trip to Louvain, gives courses based on Know Yourself, like those seminars in Pamiers, Senlis, and elsewhere, converted by the indefatigable zeal of the disciple des Huiliers. These institutions we do not speak, to be sure, of the counterfeits that proliferated are commendable in the exactitude with which they follow the methods exercises, Calypso, Calypso could not, and, after that, the improvisations, compositions, verifications, synonyms, etc. In short, all of Jacques' teaching is respected there except in one or two small matters. They are not teaching what they don't know. But not everyone who wants to be can be ignorant, and it isn't Boutmy's fault if he trained in ancient languages, or Desprez, if he is a mathematician, and one of the best at that. The prospectuses don't talk about the equality of intelligence either. But this, as we know, is an opinion of the founder. And he himself taught us to separate opinions strictly from facts and to base any demonstration only on the latter. What good is it to startle skeptical or half-convinced minds with the brutal preliminary of that opinion? It's better to put facts in front of them, the results of the method, to show them the principle's strength. Page 124. This is also why Jacques' name is not broadcasted and dishonored. Instead they speak of the natural method, a method recognized by the best minds of the past, Socrates and Montaigne, Locke and Condillac. Hadn't the master himself said that there was no Jacques method, only the student's method, the natural method of the human mind? So what good would it do to brandish his name like a fan? As early as 1828, Durietz had warned the founder that he wanted to chop down the tree of abstractions, but he wouldn't do it like a woodcutter. He wanted to creep slowly and engineer several ostensible successes in order to prepare the method's triumph. He wanted to move toward intellectual emancipation through universal teaching. 16. But the victorious revolution of 1830 offered a more grandiose theater for that effort. The occasion arose in 1831, provided by the most modern of the progressives, the young journalist Émile de Girardin. He was 26 years old. He was the grandson of the Marquis de Girardin who had protected Emile's author. It's true he was a bastard, but this was the start of a new era when no one had to blush about one's birth. He was one with the new era and the new forces, work and industry, professional instruction and domestic economy, public opinion and the press. He laughed at Latinists and pedants. He laughed at the young fools the good provincial families sent to Paris to study law and flirt with working girls. He wanted active elites, lands fertilized by the latest chemical discoveries, a people educated in everything that could lead to its material happiness, and enlightened on the balance of rights, duties, and interests that creates the equilibrium of modern societies. He wanted all this to come about very fast, for youth to be prepared by rapid methods to become useful to the community at an early age, for the discoveries of scholars and inventors to become part of the life of workshops and households immediately, even in the most distant countryside, so new thoughts might be engendered. He wanted an organ to disseminate these benefits without delay. Of course, there was de Lastary's Journal de Connaissances Usuelles. Page 125. But this kind of publication was expensive and thus inevitably reserved for a public who had no need of it. What good was it to vulgarize science for academics and domestic science for women of high society? So he launched the Journal de Connaissances Utiles in an edition of 100,000 copies through a gigantic subscription and advertising campaign. To sustain the journal and prolong its action, he founded a new society and called it simply the National Society for Intellectual Emancipation. The principle of that emancipation was simple. For constitutions as for edifices, a firm and level soil is necessary. Instruction gives intelligence a level, a soil for ideas. Instruction for the masses puts absolutist governments in danger. Their ignorance, on the other hand, is perilous to republican governments, for though the masses can learn of their rights through parliamentary debates, they cannot be expected to exercise them with discernment. As soon as a people knows its rights, there is only one way to govern it, and that is to instruct it. Thus, what is necessary to every republican government is a vast system of graduated teaching, national and professional, that sheds light onto the dark souls of the masses, that replaces all arbitrary demarcations, that assigns each class to its rank, each man to his place. 17. This new order was, of course, that of the recognized dignity of the laboring population, of its preponderant place in the social order. Intellectual emancipation was the overturning of the old hierarchy attached to instruction's privilege. Until that time, instruction had been the monopoly of the managing classes, justifying their hegemony, with the well-known consequence that an educated child of the people no longer wanted his parents' life. The social logic of the system had to be overturned. From now on, instruction would no longer be a privilege, rather, the lack of instruction would be an incapacity. To oblige the people to get educated, any man of 20 who could not read in 1840 should be declared an incapable civilian. One of the first numbers from the drawing that condemned unlucky young people to military service must be officially reserved for him. Page 126. This obligation contracted with the people was just as much an obligation contracted against it. Expeditious methods to teach all French youth how to read before 1840 had to be found. This would be the National Society for Intellectual Emancipation's motto: pour instruction onto the heads of the people, you owe it this baptism. Over the baptismal font stood the secretary of the society, the rake from the Society of Methods, Universal Teaching's enthusiastic admirer, Eugene Boutmy. In the journal's first issue, he promised to indicate expeditious methods for educating the masses. He kept his word in an article entitled Teaching by Oneself. The master should read aloud Calypso and the student repeat Calypso, then, separating the words well, CLISO could, Calypso could not, etc. The method was called natural universal teaching, in honor of nature itself, which taught it to children. An honorable deputy, Victor de Tracy, had instructed 40 peasants from his commune in this way with enough success that they were able to write a letter in which they poured out to him their deep gratitude for his having thus ushered them into intellectual life. Let each reader of the Journal do the same, and soon the leprosy of ignorance would disappear entirely from the social body. 18. The society, which wished to encourage exemplary institutions, was also interested in Desprez's establishment. It sent commissaries to examine that method of autodidaxy that taught young boys to reflect, to speak, and to reason from facts, by following the natural method that had always been the vehicle of great discoveries. The establishment's location on the Rue de Monceau, in the Parisian quarter most known for its air, the wholesomeness of its food, its hygiene, and its gymnastics, as well as its moral and religious sentiments, left little to be desired. And, in 3 years of secondary teaching, at a maximum price of 800 francs a year, the institution undertook to bring its students to the point where they could pass any examination. Thus, a father could foresee exactly how much his son's education would cost and calculate whether it was worthwhile. The society conferred on Desprez's institution the title National Lycée. Page 127. On the other hand, it urged the parents who sent their children there to read the programs carefully so as to determine what career their sons should follow. That career determined, the Society's commissaries watched to make sure that the course of study the parents wanted was scrupulously followed, so that the student would learn everything needed for a distinguished profession, and, above all, that he didn't learn anything superfluous. 19. Unfortunately, the commissaries hardly had time to pursue their collaboration with the National Lycée's work. A Breton agricultural institution, designed to spread agronomical knowledge at the same time that it regenerated part of the unemployed city youth, was the financial abyss into which the National Society for Intellectual Emancipation lapsed. At least it had sown seeds for the future. It was a good journal, that useful knowledge one. We took your word about intellectual emancipation, and we are emancipating our subscribers by dint of explications. That kind of emancipation is not at all dangerous. When a horse is bridled and mounted by a good horseman, we know where we're going. He doesn't know anything, but we can be calm, he will not stray in the mountains and valleys. 20. The triumph of the old master. And so universal teaching and even the words intellectual emancipation could be put in the service of progressives who in fact worked to the old master's greatest profit. The division of labor worked this way: for the progressives, the methods and licenses, the reviews and journals maintaining the love of explications by the indefinite perfecting of their perfecting; for the old master, the institutions and the examinations, the administration of the solid foundations of the explicative institution, and the power of social sanction. From there all those licensed inventions that collide with each other in the void of the explicatory system, explications of reading, writing metamorphosed, languages made simple, synoptical tables, perfected. Page 128. Methods, etc., and so many other beautiful things, copied into new books containing a new explication of the old ones, everything recommended by the perfected explicators of our era, who all rightly make fun of each other as forerunners. Never have certified officers been more to be pitied than in our time. There are so many of them that they can hardly find a schoolchild who doesn't have his little perfected explication, to the point that they will soon be reduced to explicating to each other their respective explications. The old master laughs at these disputes, excites them, names commissions to judge them, and, since the commissions approve all the perfectings, he doesn't part with his old scepter for anyone. Divide and conquer. The old master retains for himself the colleges, universities, and conservatories; he gives the others only what's left and tells them that's already a lot, and they believe it. Like time, the explicatory system is nourished by its own children whom it devours as it produces them. A new explication, a new perfecting is born and immediately dies to make room for 1,000 others. And thus the explicatory system is renewed, thus the Latin colleges and the Greek universities are maintained. People will cry out, but the colleges will endure. People will make fun of them, but the most learned and the most enlightened will continue to greet each other, humorlessly, in their old ceremonial suits. The young industrial method will insult its grandmother's scientific affectations, and yet the industrialists will still use their rulers and their perfected compasses to build a throne where the old driveler can sit and rule over all the workshops. In a word, the industrialists will make explicatory professorial chairs for as long as there is wood on the earth. 21 Thus the victory in progress of the luminous over the obscurantists work to rejuvenate the oldest cause defended by the obscurantists, the inequality of intelligence. There wasn't, in fact, any inconsistency in this division of roles. What the progressives' distraction was based on is the passion that underlies all distraction, the opinion of inequality. A progressive explicator is first of all an explicator, that is to say, a defender of inequality. It's very true that the social order doesn't require anyone to believe in inequality, nor does it prevent anyone from announcing emancipation to individuals and families. Page 129. But that simple announcement, which there are never enough police to prevent, is also the one that meets the most impenetrable resistance, that of the intellectual hierarchy that has no other power except the rationalization of inequality. Progressivism is the modern form of that power, purified of any mixture with the material forms of traditional authority. Progressives have no power other than that ignorance, that incapacity of the people on which their priesthood is based. How, without opening up an abyss under their own feet, can they say to working people that they don't need them in order to be free men, in order to be educated in everything suitable to their dignity as men? Each one of these so-called emancipators has his herd of emancipated people whom he saddles, bridles, and spurs onward. 22 Thus, they all found themselves united in rejecting the only bad method, the disastrous method, that is to say, the method of bad emancipation, Jacques' method, or rather, his anti-method. Those who erased this proper name knew what they were doing. For it was the proper name that made all the difference, that said equality of intelligence, and would have opened up the abyss underneath the feet of all the givers of instruction and of happiness to the people. The name need only be silenced for the announcement not to take place. You cry out in vain in writing. Those who don't know how to read can only learn from us what you have printed, and we would be very foolish to announce to them that they don't need our explications. If we give reading lessons to some, we will continue to use all the good methods, never those that could give the idea of intellectual emancipation. Let's make sure not to begin with having them read prayers. The child who knows them might think that he could have figured them out by himself. He must above all never know that he who knows how to read prayers can learn to read everything else by himself. Let's make sure never to pronounce those emancipatory words, learning and relating. 23. What had to be prevented above all was letting the poor know that they could educate themselves by their own abilities, that they had abilities, those abilities that in the social and political. Page 130. Order now succeeded the old titles of nobility. And the best way to do this was to educate them, that is to say, to give them the measure of their inability. Schools were opened everywhere, and nowhere did anyone want to announce the possibility of learning without a master explicator. Intellectual emancipation had founded its politics on a principle, not to seek to penetrate social institutions, to work instead with individuals and families. But this was a moment when that separation, which was emancipation's only chance, was breaking down. Social institutions, intellectual corporations, and political parties now came knocking on families' doors, addressing themselves to all individuals for the purpose of educating them. Heretofore, the university and its baccalaureate had only controlled access to a few professions, a few thousand lawyers, doctors, and academy ICS. All the other social careers were open to those who formed themselves in their own way. It wasn't, for example, necessary to have a baccalaureate to be a polytechnician. But with the system of perfected explications came the installation of the system of perfected examinations. From this point on, the old master, with the help of the perfecters, would increasingly use his examinations to curb the liberty to learn by any means other than his explications and the noble ascension of his degrees. The perfected examination, the exemplary representation of the master's omniscience and of the student's inability to ever equal him, was from that point on erected as the unbendable power of the inequality of intelligence over the path of whoever might wish to move through society at his own pace. Intellectual emancipation thus saw its retrenchments, the pockets of the old order, inexorably invested by the advances of the explicatory machine. Society pedagogicized. Everyone conspired in this, and especially those most passionately bent on the republic and the happiness of the people. Page 131. Republicans take the sovereignty of the people as a principle, but they know very well that the sovereign people cannot be identified with the ignorant swarm devoted solely to the defense of its own material interests. They also know very well that the republic signifies the equality of rights and duties, but that it cannot decree the equality of intelligence. It is clear, in fact, that a backward peasant does not have the intelligence of a republican leader. Some think that this inevitable inequality derives from social diversity, like the infinite variety of leaves derives from the inexhaustible richness of nature. One need only make sure that the inferior intelligence not be prevented from understanding his rights and, especially, his duties. Others think that time, little by little, progressively, will attenuate the deficiency caused by centuries of oppression and obscurity. In the two cases, equalities cause good equality, non-disastrous equality has the same requisite, the instruction of the people, the instruction of the ignorant by the learned, of men buried in egotistical material concerns by men of devotion, of individuals enclosed in their particularities by the universality of reason and public power. This is called public instruction, that is to say, the instruction of the empirical people, programmed by the representatives of the sovereign concept of the people. Public instruction is the secular arm of progress, the way to equalize inequality progressively, that is to say, to unequalize equality indefinitely. Everything is still played out according to a sole principle, the inequality of intelligence. If this principle is granted, then one consequence alone can logically be deduced from it, the intelligent caste's management of the stupid multitude. Republicans and all sincere men of progress feel heavy-hearted at this consequence. All their efforts are directed at agreeing with the principle without accepting the consequence. This is what the eloquent author of the Book of the People, Félicite Robert Delaunay, makes clear. Without a doubt, he recognizes honestly, men do not possess equal faculties. 24 But must the man of the people, for all that, be condemned to passive obedience, be brought down to the level of an animal? It cannot be this way. The sublime attribute of intelligence, self-sovereignty, distinguishes the man from the brute. 25 Page 132. Undoubtedly the unequal distribution of this sublime attribute imperils the city of God that the preacher urged the people to build. But it remains possible if the people know how to use wisely its regained rights. The ways that the man of the people might not be brought down, the ways that he might use wisely his rights, the ways to make equality out of inequality, this is the education of the people, that is to say, the interminable making up for its belatedness. Such is the logic that puts things in their place, that of the reduction of inequalities. Whoever has consented to the efficiency of the inequality of intelligence, whoever has refused the unique equality that the social order can allow, can do nothing but run from fiction to fiction, and from ontology to corporation, to reconcile the sovereign people with the retarded people, the inequality of intelligence with the reciprocity of rights and duties. Public instruction, the instituted social fiction of inequality as lateness, is the magician that will reconcile all these reasonable beings. It will do it by infinitely extending the field of its explications and the examinations that control them. By this account, the old master will always win, supported by a new industrial pulpit and the luminous faith of the progressives. Against this there is nothing else to do but to tell those supposedly sincere men again and again to pay more attention, change the form, untie the tether, break every pact with the old master. Realize that he is not any stupider than you. Reflect on this and you will tell me what you think about it. 26. But how could they ever understand the consequence? How could they understand that the mission of the luminous is not to enlighten those who dwell in obscurity? What man of science and devotion would accept in this way to leave his light under a basket and the salt of the earth without savor? And how would the fragile young plants, the childlike minds of the people, how would they grow without the beneficial dew of explications? 133. Who could understand that the way for them to rise up in the intellectual order is not to learn what they don't know from scholars but rather to teach it to other ignorant ones? A man might, with a great deal of difficulty, understand this raisonning, but no learned person will ever understand it. Even Joseph Jacques himself would never have understood it without the chance event that had turned him into the ignorant schoolmaster. Only chance is strong enough to overturn the instituted and incarnated belief in inequality. And yet a nothing would be all that's necessary. It would suffice for the friends of the people, for one short instant, to fix their attention on this point of departure, on this first principle summed up in a very simple and very old metaphysical axiom: the nature of the totality cannot be the same as that of its parts. Whatever rationality is given to society is taken from the individuals that make it up. And what is refused to the individuals, society can easily take for itself, but it can never give it back to them. This goes for reason as it goes for equality, which is reason's synonym. One must choose to attribute reason to real individuals or to their fictive unity. One must choose between making an unequal society out of equal men and making an equal society out of unequal men. Whoever has some taste for equality shouldn't hesitate. Individuals are real beings, and society a fiction. It's for real beings that equality has value, not for a fiction. One need only learn how to be equal men in an unequal society. This is what being emancipated means. But this very simple thing is the hardest to understand, especially since the new explication progress has inextricably confused equality with its opposite. The task to which the Republican hearts and minds are devoted is to make an equal society out of unequal men, to reduce inequality indefinitely. But whoever takes this position has only one way of carrying it through to the end, and that is the integral pedagogicization of society, the general infantilization of the individuals that make it up. Later on this will be called continuing education, that is to say, the co-extension of the explicatory institution with society. Page 134. The society of the superior inferiors will be equal. It will have reduced its inequalities once it has been entirely transformed into a society of explicated explicators. Joseph Jacques' singularity, his madness, was to have sensed this. His was the moment when the young cause of emancipation, that of the equality of men, was being transformed into the cause of social progress. And social progress was first of all progress in the social order's ability to be recognized as a rational order. This belief could only develop to the detriment of the emancipatory efforts of reasonable individuals, at the price of stifling the human potential embraced in the idea of equality. An enormous machine was revving up to promote equality through instruction. This was equality represented, socialized, made unequal, good for being perfected, that is to say, deferred from commission to commission, from report to report, from reform to reform, until the end of time. Jacques was alone in recognizing the effacement of equality under progress, of emancipation under instruction. Let's understand this well. Outspoken anti-progressives were a dime a dozen in that century, and the atmosphere today, one of a fatigued progress, leads us to praise their lucidity. This is perhaps to give them too much honor. They merely hated equality. They hated progress because, like the progressives, they confused it with equality. Jacques was the only egalitarian to perceive the representation and institutionalization of progress as a renouncing of the moral and intellectual adventure of equality, public instruction as the grief work of emancipation. A knowledge of this sort makes for a frightening solitude. Jacques assumed that solitude. He refused all progressive and pedagogical translation of emancipatory equality. On this point he agreed with the disciples who hid his name under the label natural method. No one in Europe was strong enough to bear that name, the name of the madman. The name Jacques was the proper name of that at once desperate and laughable knowledge of the equality of reasonable beings buried under the fiction of progress. Page 135. The Paincastic Stories. There was nothing else to do but to maintain the gap attached to the proper name. Jacques thus brought things into focus. For the progressives that came to see him, he had a sieve to put them through. When they became impassioned for the cause of equality in his presence, he softly said, "One can teach what one doesn't know." Unfortunately, the sieve worked too well. It was like trying to put a finger in the dike. The saying, they said unanimously, was poorly chosen. A little army of disciples tried to hold the flag against the professors of natural universal teaching. With them he proceeded in his way, tranquilly. He divided them into two groups, teacher or explicator disciples of the Jacques method who sought to lead the students of universal teaching to intellectual emancipation, emancipatory disciples who taught only with emancipation as a preliminary, or who even taught nothing at all and were content to emancipate fathers by showing them how to teach their children what they didn't know. It goes without saying that he didn't hold the two in equal esteem. He preferred an ignorant emancipated person, one alone, to 100 million scholars taught by universal teaching and not emancipated. 27 But the very word Emancipation had become equivocal. After the fall of the Girardin enterprise, Desprez had retitled his journal Emancipation, generously plumped up with the best essays by the National Lycée students. A society for the propagation of universal teaching became associated with it, a society whose vice president pleaded eloquently for the necessity of qualified masters and the impossibility of fathers of poor families concerning themselves with their children's education. The difference had to be underlined. Jacques' journal, the one that his two sons edited under his dictation, illness prevented him from writing. He was obliged to hold up a head that no longer wanted to hold itself straight. This journal thus took the title of Journal de Philosophie Paincastique. In its image, the faithful created a society for Paincastic philosophy. No one would try to take that name away from him. Page 136. We know what it meant. In each intellectual manifestation, there is a totality of human intelligence. The Paincastician is a lover of discourse, like the mischievous Socrates and the naive Phaedrus. But unlike Plato's protagonists, he doesn't recognize any hierarchy among orators or discourses. What interests him is, on the contrary, looking for their equality. He doesn't expect truth from any discourse. Truth is felt and not spoken. It furnishes a rule governing the speaker's conduct, but it will never be manifested in his sentences. Nor does the Paincastian judge the morality of a discourse. The morality that counts for him is the one that presides over the act of speaking and writing, that of the intention to communicate, of recognizing the other as an intellectual subject capable of understanding what another intellectual subject wants to say to him. The Paincastician is interested in all discourses, in every intellectual manifestation, to a unique end, to verify that they put the same intelligence to work, to verify, by translating the one into the other, the equality of intelligence. This presupposed an original relation to the debates of the time. The intellectual battle on the subject of the people and its capacity was raging. Delaunay had published his book of the people. Jean-Louis Lerminier, a repentant Saint-Simonian and oracle of the Revue des Deux Mondes, had denounced the book's inconsistency. George Sand, in her turn, had raised the flag of the people and its sovereignty. The Journal de Philosophie Paincastique analyzed each of these intellectual manifestations. Each pretended to attest to the truth of a political camp. That was something that concerned the citizen, but the Paincastician got nothing out of it. What interested him in that cascade of refutations was the art that some used to express what they meant. He would show how, by translating themselves to each other, they were translating 1,000 other poems, 1,000 other adventures of the human mind, of classical works from the story of Bluebeard to the retorts of proletarians on the Place Maubert. Page 137. The search for art was not a learned person's pleasure. It was a philosophy, the only one the people could practice. The old philosophies said the truth and taught morals. They supposed, for that, a high degree of learning. The Paincastician, on the other hand, didn't say the truth and preached no morals. And it was simple and easy, like the story each person tells of his intellectual adventures. It's the story of each one of us. No matter what your specialty is, shepherd or king, you can discuss the human mind. Intelligence is at work in all trades, it is seen at all the levels of the social ladder. The father and the son, both ignorant, can talk to each other about paincastics. 28. The problem of the proletarians, excluded from the official society and from political representation, was no different from the problem of the learned and the powerful. Like them, they couldn't become men in the full sense of the word except by recognizing equality. Equality is not given, nor is it claimed, it is practiced, it is verified. And proletarians couldn't verify it except by recognizing the equality of intelligence of their champions and their adversaries. They were undoubtedly interested, for example, in freedom of the press, under attack from the September 1835 laws. But they had to recognize that the reasoning of the defenders of that principle had neither more nor less force in trying to establish it than its adversaries had trying to refute it. In short, said some, I want people to have the liberty to say everything they should have the liberty to say. In short, responded the others, I don't want people to have the liberty to say everything they shouldn't have the liberty to say. What was important, the manifestation of liberty, lay elsewhere, in the equal art that, in order to support these antagonistic positions, the one translated from the other, in the esteem for that power of the intelligence that doesn't cease being exercised at the very heart of rhetorical irrationality, in the recognition of what speaking can mean for whoever renounces the pretension of being right and saying the truth at the price of the other's death. To appropriate for oneself that art, to conquer that reason, this was what counted for the proletarians. One must first be a man before being a citizen. Page 138. Whatever side in this fight he might take as a citizen, as a Paincastician he must admire his adversaries' minds. A proletarian, rejected by the class of electors, is not required to find equitable what he regards as a usurpation or to like usurpers. But he must study the art of those who explain to him how he is plundered for his own good. 29. There was nothing else to do but to persist in indicating the extravagant path that consists in seizing in every sentence, in every act, the side of equality. Equality was not an end to attain, but a point of departure, a supposition to maintain in every circumstance. Never would truth speak up for it. Never would equality exist except in its verification and at the price of being verified always and everywhere. This was not a speech to be made to the people, it was only an example, or rather a few examples, to point out while conversing. It was a moral of the failure and the distance to be held to the end with whoever wanted to share it. Seek the truth and you will not find it, knock at its door and it will not open to you, but that search will serve you in learning to do. Stop drinking at that fountain, but don't, for all that, stop trying to drink. Come and we will make our poetry. Long live the Paincastic philosophy. It's a storyteller who never runs out of stories. It gives itself over to the pleasure of the imagination without having to settle accounts with the truth. It sees that veiled figure only beneath the travesties that hide it. It is content to see those masks, to analyze them, without being tormented by the countenance underneath. The old master is never content. He lifts up a mask, rejoices, but his joy doesn't last long. He soon perceives that the mask he has taken off covers another one, and so on until the end of all truth seekers. The lifting of those superimposed masks is what we call the history of philosophy. Oh, the beautiful history! I like the Paincastic stories better. Point 30. Page 139. Emancipation's Tomb. And so ends the Mélanges posthumes de philosophie Paincastici, published in 1841 by Joseph Jacques' sons, Victor, the doctor, and Fortune, the lawyer. The founder died on August 7, 1840. On his tomb in the Père Lachaise cemetery, the disciples inscribed the credo of intellectual emancipation: I believe that God created the human soul capable of teaching itself by itself, and without a master. This kind of thing is certainly not written, even on the marble of a tomb. A few months later, the inscription was desecrated. The news of the desecration appeared in the journal de l'Emancipation intellectuelle, whose flame Victor and Fortune Jacques tried to keep alive. But one cannot replace the voice of a solitary man, even when one has, for many years, held his pen. From issue to issue, the journal filled up with the expanding accounts that Devorix, an attorney at the Lyon court, made of the activities of the Institute of the Word Incarnate that Louis Guillard, it will be recalled, ran in Lyon according to the principles he learned on his trip to Louvain. Teaching should be founded on the maxim know yourself. Thus the daily self-examination practiced by the young souls of the pensioners gave them the moral force that presided over their intellectual apprenticeships. In the September 1842 issue, the hard and pure Paincasticians protested this curious application of the emancipatory doctrine. But it was no longer the moment for debate. 2 months later, the Journal de l'Emancipation intellectuelle in its turn fell silent. The founder had predicted it all: universal teaching wouldn't take. He had also added that it would not perish.